I've been involved with instrumentation and monitoring for many years now. I started in the railway industry in Britain in 1979 with British Rail, and I started work on a large landslip site between Folkestone and Dover. Not only was it a landslip site, but also with two tunnels running between the famous white chalk cliffs between Folkestone and Dover in Kent. But I also got involved with lots of other smaller bank slip sites, retaining walls, transformer bases and platforms. So quite a wide variety of different types of monitoring that we performed at that time. Well, it was very much a very labour-intensive exercise with mainly things like what we could term theodolite straits and levelling. So theodolite straits is measuring offsets from a straight line to fixed points, but also with boreholes, with a plunger that you just drop down to see whether there'd been any movement slightly lower in a slip site. But one of the key things was that the calculation of the results was very slow and often time consuming, which meant that the communication of the results to the stakeholders was often, could easily be in a month or more after the results were measured, by which time, of course, things might have changed quite dramatically anyway. Monitoring now is much less labour intensive, and of course, once it's installed, there's minimal maintenance, which is great in terms of keeping the costs down. And originally, with the new types of electronic kit, as they gradually got introduced, there were lots of cables required for power supply and communication of the results to the site cabin where the results were read. But these were often subject to damage from be it animals or be it the actual slip occurring itself, which damaged all the cabling, and so there were no results to read. But of course, now we've got wireless and Wi-Fi communication. It's overcome many of these problems and means that monitoring now is much more reliable in terms of the results that it achieves. The advent of automatic total stations with automatic target recognition with cameras as well to look at the site and laser scanning as well, all on the same unit, has also revolutionised the way monitoring can be achieved. And it's a far cry from how we were in the beginning using conventional optical theodolites and just a simple distance measuring tools. So it's been a massive change over a relatively short period of time. Well, I first heard about Sensieve some years ago when I was working with University College London on a UCL on another project, and I was told about Sensieve and that they thought it would be worth my while hearing a bit more about them. So it was then that Graham Smith, the CEO, approached me in my role as Senior Survey Engineer for Network Rail during about 2014. And I heard all about the tilt sensors and linking them together wirelessly then. And this seemed to me to be a really good approach to take, as it removed people from the track having to do work. And once these things were installed, they continued to work remotely without any need for them to be triggered on a regular basis. I think the biggest, of course, was Folkestone Warren that I've already spoken about. And I wrote my professional thesis for my RICS membership on this. And prior to a review of what we were doing at Folkestone, we were using a relative monitoring approach, as I said before, with the type of approaches that we said. And this changed to using an absolute survey framework that was analysed using least squares to get the most efficient and cost-effective approach, using classical triangulation, but still using optical theodolites and EDM distances. Later, we started to use digital levelling, and that saved around 10 days of site work to perform something like 3.5 to 4 kilometres of double levelling. In the early days, the results were often ambiguous. The results said movements had occurred where often it wasn't possible. So that it really shows that there is a need to sense check the results before communicating them on to stakeholders. And I think that is still very key even today with the more sophisticated equipment that we can use. So it's always important to have an independent method to verify the results as well. So in other words, you have two types of monitoring techniques that are independent being used to measure the same types of things so that we can see if there's a correlation between them. But one of the other important things is to try to have a baseline period where measurements are done to ensure that the normal changes that occur in a structure over the seasons can be accommodated and not flag up significant changes when these are only the changes that occur due to the seasonal effects. But one of the things that is also important is that the people who are specifying the monitoring work need to have an understanding of the sort of movements that are going to be expected and that they must be measurable with the tools and techniques that are proposed to be used. So often in the past, the type of movements and the size of movements that were expected were barely measurable using the techniques that were being used. And whereas now, using things like tilt meters, it's much easier to detect even very small movements. All of us know about the climate change agenda that everybody's heard about now. And of course, the extreme weather associated with climate change. This has a dramatic effect on many embankments and cuttings and causes failures to occur, whereas in the past that would not have happened in quite the same way. But one of the other things is also the attitude to risk has changed to being much more risk averse. Therefore, that means that anything that is in any doubt as to its stability will need to be measured, because if they're not measured, somebody's head will be on the block if there are particular problems, and quite rightly so too. But one of the other issues now is that monitoring, once it's installed, is much less labour intensive than it used to be. So very much less manpower is needed to keep these things running and to read the results. So therefore, over a longer period of time, it's possible to monitor things and not incur enormous costs due to that factor alone. However, new technology has also enabled what previously would have been almost impossible to do. The use of tilt meters is a typical example whereby in the past, if we had pipe jacking going on underneath the railway, probably we would have had to have installed points on the track that would have had to have been measured 24/7, probably every 2 hours or something. And somebody, poor soul, would have to be out there 24/7 doing that for about 3 or 4 weeks. So it was quite a massive manpower implication. Whereas now, once the tilt meters are installed and they're all functioning correctly and communicating correctly to the hub, that does away with so much of the manpower. So the technology really has made a massive improvement in what is possible now. One of the biggest improvements is the ease of communication of what is happening to stakeholders. In the past, that may well have taken a number of weeks, as I said before, whereas now we almost have instantaneous communication of what is happening to the stakeholders, should there be an issue that they need to resolve. Of course, the advent of the software to analyse the results as they come in is also really critical, because that means that the results can be analysed quickly. Any any outliers can be removed from the results before they become critical, and an understanding of what is happening very quickly can be achieved by comparing the results from two different types of sensors. So the new technology for the sensors has also improved things dramatically, and I'm sure the ability of sensors to record things, not only movements, but also environmental factors and associated with the weather as well, improves the use and reliability of instrumentation and monitoring results. The sensors are also very accurate now, and we get repeatable measurements. I mean, in the past, it was quite often possible to have measurements that you were effectively measuring the same thing, but you got very significantly different results when they were analysed. I go back really to this one at Folkestone Warren because this was very much the project that I cut my teeth on, but how that would be done today would be very different. And I do know that laser scanning of the cliffs have been done now, so that the results can be compared with the last measurement to check for changes and, of course, imminent cliff falls, which could have quite a significant impact on the railway. The idea of having a video camera set up to trigger an alert when a movement occurs, instead of a stretched wire that was prone to disturbance, there was a wire that was set all the way along the fence line adjacent to the railway at Folkestone Warren, that if it got disturbed in any way would immediately trigger a signal to red. It was associated with the signalling system. And of course now something like that could be done much easier. But of course it then requires the trains to be stopped and an inspection of the railway to take place, which causes delays to trains and lots of unhappy customers on the railway. So I think this kind of approach using video cameras is quite a new way of looking at things that can also bring quite significant benefits, but also video monitoring of lines of pegs, I think, is quite a useful approach to be taken. But also part of the things at Folkestone was tunnel monitoring, where we were monitoring something called Abbots Cliff Tunnel and Shakespeare Tunnel and Martello Tunnel, in fact, a smaller tunnel at one end of the site. And all three of those tunnels had pins put in the side of the tunnel that were measured by using a theodolite straight and an offset. The situation in the past, as I said, was simply measuring offsets from a straight line defined by a theodolite, whereas now I think we would use an optical displacement sensor, which is effectively a laser-based extensometer for measuring the offsets and measuring the tunnel shape to see whether the shape was being deformed over a period of time. These could be installed in such a way that they wouldn't cause an obstruction to a train passing through the tunnel, and therefore would give us a much more reliable and real-time measurement of what was going on, which would be far more accurate and reliable, because when sighting through a tunnel, there's considerable refraction caused by the different temperatures of the air passing through the tunnel. And it could be quite different depending on which direction the wind's blowing. And just to give you an idea of the strangeness of the refraction effect, looking through, I think, Abbots Cliff Tunnel, it looked out through the far end of the tunnel, at the Dover end, at the approaches of where the ferries from the channel were coming into Dover. And it, for all the world, looked as if that ship was about to enter the tunnel. So it's a very peculiar approach. The use of tilt meters also, again, to check track level on cant will be a very significant change and prevent, again, a lot more levelling. But also the use of automated total stations with ATR to check that's automatic target recognition, to check the movement trackside would be an important addition to the kit being used now, as well as continuously operating GNSS or GPS at critical locations for the survey control and permanent ground markers. So there's quite a few changes that I think would be really significant in the way in which the work would be done. With things like HS2 coming on stream now, with a lot of monitoring work associated with that, the need for these approaches is really important and is going to feed further development of monitoring techniques and technology.